So this is the final video covering the neurotransmitters part of the cells of the nervous system and neurotransmitters section of Unit 3 of the higher human biology course. So this part, there's going to be quite a lot of writing on this, but it's mainly just so that I didn't have to write it all and I could explain it as I go, so I don't have to juggle two bits. There's a lot of detail in this that can get quite confusing because there's a lot of words that sound similar. Okay, so you really need to understand how a neuron works and how neurotransmitters pass across a synaptic cleft. And you need to know the structure of those in basic forms. Okay, now it's going to talk about different drugs and different issues that people have when it comes to neurotransmitter balance disorders and things like that. Okay, and just generally it'll cover some of the neurotransmitters and how they work. So you will know a couple of examples of neurotransmitters. You'll know acetylcholine and noradrenaline, and you may know a few more. Okay, but the two that you will need to know for this would be endorphins, okay, which is what the first one is here. And the other one is dopamine. Okay, now endorphins you probably have heard of because it's associated with the runner's high. So if you go and do any kind of level of exercise, right, like prolonged exercise, then you'll get endorphin release. Now, endorphins are really important because they reduce the intensity of pain. They don't take pain away, but they're essentially a kind of natural painkiller. They dampen down that intensity of pain. Okay, so not only can that be produced during prolonged exercise, but because of injury, right? Sometimes that's why people get a little bit addicted to getting tattoos, because the pain that they then feel when they're getting tattooed then releases endorphins, which actually make you feel better about it. Okay, stress, emotional and physical stress releases endorphins, and so do some foods. So chili and chocolate are two of the foods that would actually release that or cause the release of that, which is why you end up feeling quite good afterwards when you eat chili or chocolate, even though chili might be sore at the time. Now, dopamine is what makes you feel pleasure, so it induces feelings of pleasure. Now, dopamine is a really important one for rewarding you for doing things that you should for your body. Okay, so it reinforces beneficial behaviours by affecting the reward pathway in the brain. So, for example, then, if you eat when you're hungry, or you drink when you're thirsty, or other things like this, that's rewarding you for doing something basic that your body needs. And that's something that would stimulate the reward pathway, okay? And that would be then dopamine that's involved, okay? That's why you feel nice after eating. Okay, so these are two neurotransmitters. So bear in mind, neurotransmitters are just chemicals that work in the brain and across neurons. Right, so next part is about neurotransmitter disorders, right? And you'll have heard about a lot of these. Neurotransmitter disorders are things like depression. You can also have things like schizophrenia. A whole bunch of mental health issues are related to just imbalances and underproduction or overproduction of neurotransmitters. Okay, so there shouldn't really be stigma along with mental health because it's just another issue within the body. Okay, it's just another issue of your body not quite being in balance and not quite working right. Okay, so when you want to treat that, you can treat it with drugs that would act in a similar way to neurotransmitters. Okay, and there's three main types of drug that we then would use to treat neurotransmitter disorders. Okay, so first of all, the main one that you've got, or one of the main ones you've got, would be an agonist. Okay, so an agonist is a drug that binds to and stimulates receptors. Okay, so essentially agonists are used when you don't have enough neurotransmitter. Alright, so say for example you've only got a few molecules of neurotransmitter and therefore only some of them bind to your receptors. What agonists do is they then come in and act like those natural neurotransmitters that you had within your neural pathways, and they would then trigger more, okay, action. So you get more binding to it, and therefore you increase nerve action. Okay, so these are agonist drugs. So the more neurotransmitters that you have binding to the receptors, the more you have a normal impulse, okay? So normal cell responses occur. Okay, so you get more of that impulse passing. So in this one, you only get a little bit because you've only got a few neurotransmitters bound. But when you add an agonist in, you get a lot of that neural activity. Okay, so normal cell activities would occur. Now the next one we have is known as an antagonist. Now you might have heard of the term antagonize before. So if you antagonize someone, you're trying to stop them from doing something or get in the way or annoy them or wind them up, okay? And that's kind of what an antagonist does. So rather than binding to and stimulating receptors like an agonist would, it binds to and it blocks receptors. Okay, and when it blocks receptors, it prevents normal neurotransmitter action. So that natural action that you should have in nerve impulse synaptic cleft would not happen. Okay, so for example then, if you've got neurotransmitters that bind here with an antagonist involved, these would bind to your receptors and they would block them. Okay, so I'm just going to add a wee bit here. So this antagonistic drug is generally used when your body's producing too much of the neurotransmitter and you don't want it to, because your neural pathways are overstimulated. So what would happen is that these would eventually either slow down or reduce or stop impulse transmission. Okay, so when you would have lots of transmission here because all the receptors have been bound to, what would happen is you'd only get a little bit, okay, because most of that has been blocked. Okay, because these receptors are blocked, you can reduce that nerve impulse transmission. Okay, and the final drug type that you can use that would then be able to treat or help a neurotransmitter disorder is about inhibition. Okay, so this one, or these types are known as inhibitors. Right, now if you think about inhibitors from before in the Unit 1 topic, we talked about inhibition of enzymes, and that's exactly what is involved here. Okay, so inhibitors can inhibit enzymes that would then remove those neurotransmitters from that synapse, or they can inhibit the reuptake of those neurotransmitters. Now either way, whichever way it does this, both of those things will then mean that there's more neurotransmitter left in the synapse. Okay, and that then leads to an enhanced effect. Okay, so you leave more of those neurotransmitters in the synaptic cleft, and it keeps causing those impulses. Right, so your three main types are agonist, antagonist, and inhibitors. Now, inhibitors aren't mentioned very often, okay, but if you were asked an NCEE question about this, these are the kind of points that you'd want to talk about. Okay, so the next part is about recreational drugs, which also affects neurochemistry. Right, so recreational drugs can act in a couple of different ways. Okay, so mainly what they would do is they either mimic neurotransmitters, so they'll act like them, or they'll act as agonists or antagonists. Okay, so they either stimulate those nerve pathways or they'll then inhibit those nerve pathways by blocking receptors. Okay, so recreational drugs will alter neurochemistry because of this. So they'll alter someone's mood, so someone that's normally happy could be angry, for example. It'll alter cognition, so your ability to do simple mental tasks like count out money or anything simple like that. Perception, it'll alter your ability in terms of seeing and hearing things like colours, sounds, all that kind of stuff. And behaviour as well, it can keep people awake and it alter their behaviour that wouldn't typically be how they would usually behave. right? So recreational drugs can lead to either drug tolerance or drug addiction, okay? And these are two very different things, but they're not really talked about as two separate things, right? So when we talk about drug tolerance, there's a weird kind of wee mnemonic that I've given in the revision posters, and this is, for this one, okay, is called DAT. Okay, the two are DAT Santa, right? But we'll come on to why that is in a second, but this one is the DAT one. Right, so I'll explain what that means in a second. So, drug tolerance. Drug tolerance is caused by drugs that act as agonists. Okay, so remember, agonists are ones that bind to and stimulate receptors. Right, and they cause something called desensitization. Right, which is a decrease in the number. So desensitization, decrease in the number and sensitivity of receptors. Right, and that means that that person would have to take a larger dose of that drug to get that original effect. Okay, and I'm going to show you how that works. So this is a postsynaptic neuron. Okay, these are the receptors on it. And I'll be the same along here. Okay, so if you take a drug, okay, a recreational drug, what will happen is it will act as an agonist, okay? So it'll bind to and stimulate so bind to and stimulate this neuron, okay, this nerve pathway. So normally it wouldn't be as active as this, but when you take that drug, okay, it produces a lot more of an impulse. Right, so that agonist binds to and stimulates it, and it causes a lot more of an impulse. Okay, so typically, I'll just get rid of this just to show you. Typically in a normal neuron, okay, it would just get bound to and would produce a little bit of an impulse. But when you have this agonist drug, or a drug that acts like an agonist, you cause a lot more of an impulse. Okay, so you're binding to and stimulating receptors, and it increases nerve transmission or nerve impulse transmission. So your neural pathways will recognize that that's not correct. Your brain should not be doing that. So what will happen is your brain will try and bring things back to normal. So what it will do to try and reduce the nerve impulses back to normal is that it will reduce the number of receptors that you have on your nerves, okay, and on that postsynaptic neuron. So notice now there's less of these receptors, and therefore there's less of an impulse. Okay, they've reduced that. Okay, so this is where you get desensitization, because they've decreased the number and the sensitivity of those receptors. So this is where your DAT Santa comes in. Okay, so D-A-T. Desensitization is caused by an agonist or an agonistic drug, okay, which leads to tolerance. Okay, D-A-T. So desensitization caused by an agonist drug, which causes tolerance. Okay, now in terms of describing this, you won't really need to describe it or explain it so much. You'll just need to describe it in exactly the same way that I've got here. So what desensitization is, and what type of drug would then lead to that desensitization. Okay, and then what that would lead to, which would be tolerance. So if you remember this and what desensitization is, which is a decrease in the number and sensitivity of receptors, okay, then you'll normally get the marks for describing that. Okay, now the other one I told you about was addiction, which is what some people have heard about before. Addiction is a chronic disease. It is an actual disease because it affects the neurochemistry. People's brains are different because of addiction. Okay, now addiction is caused by different types of drugs. So not agonist now, it's antagonist now. And this is where we'd use Santa. Okay, So in this neuron, normal impulses would occur. Okay? But then what happens is you would then have an antagonistic drug. Now bear in mind, the antagonistic ones block receptors. So you would get an antagonistic drug. And what they do is they block those receptors. And therefore that impulse is not allowed to occur, okay, or is severely reduced. Now what your nerves then do, or your neurons do in response to this, is they then undergo sensitization, which is where you increase the number and sensitivity of the receptors. So you produce more of those receptors. Okay, so rather than having 3 now, your brain produces loads and loads and loads of these receptors. So that therefore, even though they're antagonist binding to and blocking some of them, your brain chemistry can still work, and you can still get some neurotransmitter normally binding to and allowing normal action and having a normal neuron impulse. Okay, but the problem with this is it leads to addiction, because you never have all those antagonists will essentially bind to those receptors and then prevent that nerve impulse. So you're constantly craving more and more and more of that drug to then get that original effect as well. Okay, so SANTA then. SANTA essentially stands for sensitization caused by antagonist drugs, which lead to addiction. Again, bear in mind, sensitization is an increase in the number and sensitivity of the receptors. Okay, so S and SANTA. Okay, now these are hard to get your head around. Okay, but if you remember these wee mnemonics, it will help you to remember what they are. Okay, so sensitization is caused by antagonistic drugs, which would then lead to addiction. All right, and that finishes off the part about neurotransmitters and their link to brain chemistry.